The battlefield was drenched in blood, and the sky roared with thunder. Ares himself would have been proud of the chaos that unfolded. In the heart of the fight stood Perseus, his blade dripping with the remains of a monstrous beast, his breath heavy, his muscles aching. But there was no time to rest. Another wave of creatures charged at him. These were not ordinary foes. They were the cursed creations of Hades, sent to wipe out the last bloodline of Zeus. Perseus knew this was not just a battle for survival. This was a war for his legacy. He tightened his grip on his sword and prepared to strike, knowing that if he fell, the gods would abandon humanity forever. Far away from the battlefield, hidden in the temple of Athena, Alexander paced nervously. Unlike Perseus, he was not a warrior but a strategist, a thinker. He knew the legends of his father, Zeus, but he never imagined that the fate of Olympus would rest on his shoulders. The world believed the age of gods was over, but Alexander knew the truth. The gods still walked among men, weakened, waiting for their chosen ones to rise. And now, with Perseus fighting for his life, Alexander had to decipher an ancient prophecy, the only thing that could save them. But the writings were cryptic, scattered across different temples. Time was running out and the enemy was closing in. In the shadows, a figure watched them both, Helios, a warrior with a secret. Unlike Perseus and Alexander, Helios was not born of Olympus, but had been raised in the underworld. Trained by Hades himself, he was a soldier of darkness, a man torn between loyalty and destiny. He had been sent to kill the sons of Zeus, yet something inside him hesitated. He had seen the cruelty of the underworld, the lies of the gods, and the suffering of mortals. If Zeus had been a god of justice, why did the world still suffer? Helios had to choose, to follow the path given to him or carve his own fate. And as he unsheathed his cursed blade, he realized that his decision would change the fate of gods and men alike. Alexander's hands trembled as he traced the symbols carved into the stone tablet. The prophecy spoke of a weapon, one forged by Hephaestus himself, hidden in the ruins of Atlantis. If he and Perseus could find it, they might stand a chance against Hades' monstrous army. But Atlantis was lost beneath the waves, swallowed by the wrath of Poseidon centuries ago. How do we find something that no longer exists? He muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. Then he noticed something, a faint shimmer on the stone. As the torchlight flickered, the markings shifted, revealing a hidden inscription. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a clue. It was a map, leading them to the weapon that could turn the tide of war. Meanwhile, Perseus stood knee-deep in the carnage, his sword barely keeping up with the relentless creatures. They weren't dying easily. Each time he struck one down, another two emerged from the mist. He could hear their guttural growls, their glowing eyes filled with hatred. He was exhausted, his muscles burning, but retreat was not an option. Then, in the distance, he saw something strange, a lone warrior standing still amid the chaos. The man's presence was unnerving. He didn't attack, didn't move. He just watched. Perseus felt an eerie familiarity, like he had seen this man before. Then it hit him. Helios, the rumored warrior of the underworld? Was he an enemy or an ally? Perseus had no time to decide as another creature lunged at him. Helios remained motionless, his fingers grazing the hilt of his blade. He had been sent to kill the sons of Zeus, yet something held him back. Watching Perseus fight, he saw more than just a warrior. He saw a man who refused to let destiny define him. For the first time, Helios questioned his orders. Hades had told him that Zeus's bloodline was a threat. But what if that was a lie? What if the real danger wasn't the sons of Zeus, but the war itself? Helios had always believed he was beyond emotions, beyond choice. But in that moment, as Perseus fought like a man with nothing to lose, Helios felt something foreign stir within him. Doubt. And doubt, he knew, could be more dangerous than any blade. Alexander wasted no time. He knew that if Perseus fell, all hope would be lost. Clutching the stone tablet, he ran toward the temple's exit, his mind racing. If the map was correct, Atlantis wasn't entirely gone. It was hidden beneath layers of illusion, protected by Poseidon's last enchantment. But reaching it would require something even more dangerous than facing Hades' creatures, entering the depths of the ocean, where even gods feared to tread. He needed to find Perseus, and fast. As he reached the temple steps, a gust of wind nearly knocked him back. The sky darkened. A deep, bone-chilling voice echoed in the air. "You cannot run from fate, child of Zeus." Alexander froze. Hades had found him. Perseus was bleeding, his vision blurry. The creatures kept coming and his strength was fading. He stole a glance at Helios, still standing motionless. Was he waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Or was he making a choice? Perseus didn't care anymore. If Helios wanted to kill him, he should do it now. With a roar, he swung his sword, slicing through another beast, but the next attack came too fast. A monstrous claw slashed across his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. His grip on his sword loosened. The battlefield spun. The creatures closed in, their snarls growing louder. Perseus braced for death, but then something unexpected happened. A blade, dark as the night, cut through the air. Helios had moved. In one swift motion, he struck down the creatures around Perseus, standing between him and death itself. Helios didn't know why he had done it. He had trained his whole life to be Hades' warrior, to follow orders without question. But watching Perseus fight, seeing him refuse to surrender despite the odds, something inside Helios shifted. Maybe destiny wasn't written in stone. Maybe he had a choice. He turned his head slightly, his voice calm yet firm. "Get up, Perseus. We're not done yet." Perseus, still panting, stared at him in disbelief. "You're helping me?" Helios didn't answer. Instead, he raised his sword. His eyes locked onto the next wave of creatures. The battle wasn't over, and for the first time in his life, Helios wasn't fighting for the underworld. He was fighting for something greater. Alexander turned slowly, his heart hammering as the shadows twisted around him. From the darkness, a tall figure emerged, his presence suffocating. Hades. His eyes burned like dying embers, his cloak swirling with whispers of lost souls. "Running will not save you, boy," Hades said, his voice smooth yet laced with menace. "Your father defied the natural order, and now his sons must pay the price." Alexander swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't a warrior like Perseus, but he wasn't powerless either. "If Zeus was so wrong, why are you afraid of his legacy?" He shot back. Hades chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Alexander's spine. "Afraid?" Number amused. "You struggle against fate, but fate always wins." With a flick of his wrist, the shadows lunged toward Alexander, twisting into chains. He barely had time to react. Perseus, still gasping for breath, watched as Helios cut through the monstrous creatures like a storm of darkness and steel. His movements were precise, effortless, as if he had trained in war for centuries. But Perseus had no time to be impressed. If Alexander was in trouble, they had to move, now. He forced himself to his feet, gripping his sword despite the searing pain in his chest. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Helios didn't stop fighting. "Because for the first time, I'm questioning what I was taught," he admitted. "Maybe the gods aren't as righteous as they claim to be. Maybe we decide what's right." Perseus stared at him, trying to read the truth behind those words. There was no time for trust, no time for doubt. "Then help me save my brother," he said. Helios hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The two warriors carved a path through the battlefield, striking down the remaining creatures as they ran toward the temple. But as they reached the steps, Perseus felt it. A heavy, suffocating presence that made the air thick. Hades, the god of the underworld, stood before Alexander, his dark chains wrapping around him like living serpents. Perseus's grip tightened on his sword. "Let him go," he shouted. Hades turned, his smirk deepening. "Ah, the favored son of Zeus," he mused. "You should have died already." With a flick of his fingers, the ground beneath them cracked, flames erupting from the depths. Perseus barely had time to react before the heat blasted toward him. But then, before the flames could consume him, a figure stepped in front of him, Helios. He raised his sword, the dark blade absorbing the fire like a void. Hades' smirk faltered. "Interesting," he muttered. Perseus had no idea what was happening. But one thing was clear. Helios wasn't just any warrior. He was something far more dangerous. Hades narrowed his eyes as the fire vanished into the void of Helios's blade. "I should have known," he muttered. "You are no ordinary warrior." Helios remained silent, his grip tightening around his sword. He had never defied Hades before, never questioned his purpose, until now. Perseus, standing beside him, glanced between the two. He could feel the tension, the weight of unspoken history. "What are you?" Perseus asked. Helios exhaled slowly. "A mistake," he admitted. Hades let out a low chuckle. "No, you were my greatest creation." Perseus's stomach twisted at the words. Creation? What did that mean? Helios didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his sword, pointing it at the god of the underworld. "Let Alexander go," he commanded. Hades sighed as if disappointed. "And here, I thought you would embrace your destiny." With a flick of his fingers, the chains around Alexander tightened. He gasped, his knees buckling. "Helios," he choked out, "do something." Perseus didn't wait. He lunged at Hades, swinging his sword with all the strength he had left. But before his blade could make contact, a shockwave of darkness erupted from Hades, throwing him backward. Perseus crashed against the temple wall, pain exploding through his ribs. Hades barely spared him a glance. "Zeus's sons are stubborn," he mused, "but stubbornness is not strength." He turned his attention back to Helios. "You were meant to be my executioner, a weapon forged in the shadows, blessed with the power of the underworld itself." Perseus, struggling to stand, realized the truth. Helios wasn't just a warrior. He was something unnatural, something built for destruction. "You were supposed to kill the sons of Zeus," Hades continued, "not stand beside them." Helios's jaw tightened. "Maybe I choose my own fate." The air around them crackled with power. Perseus forced himself up, his mind racing. If Helios truly was Hades' weapon, that meant he held a power strong enough to defy even the gods. "Helios," Perseus called, gripping his sword. "Whatever you are, whatever they made you for, it doesn't have to define you." Helios didn't respond, but something in his stance shifted. The weight of centuries of control, of being a tool for destruction, cracked just slightly. Hades watched, unimpressed. Still pretending to be human, he scoffed. Very well. If you refuse to fulfill your purpose, then you will die with them. The ground beneath them rumbled, the air turning thick with shadow. Hades was done playing games. This was war. The temple trembled as Hades unleashed his full power. Shadows erupted from the ground, twisting into monstrous forms with hollow eyes and jagged claws. The air grew thick, suffocating. Perseus gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand despite the pain. Alexander, still bound by the dark chains, struggled to breathe. Helios remained still, his grip on his sword tightening. He had been raised in this darkness, molded by it. He knew its weight, its suffocating grip on the soul. But for the first time, he wasn't fighting as Hades' weapon, he was fighting for himself. With a single step forward, Helios swung his sword. The darkness around him twisted violently, recoiling as if burned. The creatures lunged at him, their claws aiming for his throat. But he moved faster, his blade cut through them effortlessly, their bodies dissolving into black mist. Hades frowned. "Interesting," he murmured. "You resist, yet your power still obeys me." Helios ignored him, his focus locked on the battle. "Perseus," he called. "Get to Alexander. I'll hold him off." Perseus hesitated for only a second before nodding. He sprinted toward his brother, dodging through the chaos. The shadows clawed at him, but he pushed forward, his sword slashing through anything in his way. "Almost there," he muttered. Alexander's face was pale, the chains squeezing tighter. "Perseus," he gasped. "Hurry." Hades sighed, unimpressed. With a flick of his hand, a wave of darkness crashed toward Perseus. But before it could reach him, Helios appeared in front of him, his blade absorbing the attack. The force sent cracks through the temple floor. Perseus looked up at him, breathless. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Helios didn't answer immediately. His entire life, he had been told he was nothing but a weapon, a creation of the Underworld. But now, standing beside Perseus and Alexander, fighting against the very god who had made him, he felt something he had never known before: purpose. He met Perseus's gaze and finally spoke, "Because I choose to." Then, with a powerful slash, he sent a shockwave of energy straight at Hades, forcing the god to take a step back for the first time. The battle had just begun. Hades' eyes flickered with something rare: mild surprise. No mortal had ever forced him to retreat, not even for a step. His amusement vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You think defiance makes you powerful, Hadrisha?" he hissed. "You are nothing, Helios. A mistake that should have been erased." He raised his hand, and the temple walls cracked as shadows coiled tighter, the air turning impossibly heavy. Perseus felt his knees weaken, his body screaming from exhaustion, but he refused to fall. "We need to break those chains," he muttered, glancing at Alexander, whose face was contorted in pain. The darkness was feeding on his strength, draining him. If they didn't act fast, he wouldn't survive. Helios moved first. His blade, forged in the depths of the Underworld, was the only thing that could cut through Hades' magic. He slashed at the chains binding Alexander, and for a moment they resisted, writhing like living things. Then, with a deafening crack, they shattered. Alexander collapsed, gasping for air. Perseus caught him, his heart pounding. "We have to go," he said. But Hades was already moving. With a flick of his wrist, a massive wave of dark fire surged toward them. Perseus braced for impact until Helios stepped forward. Raising his blade, he absorbed the flames just as he had before. But this time, something changed. The fire didn't just vanish, it fused into his sword. The once dark blade now burned with an eerie glow, pulsing with stolen power. Hades' expression darkened. "So, that's your choice," he murmured. "Very well." The shadows around him twisted violently, forming something monstrous. A towering figure, skeletal with flaming eyes, its claws long enough to tear through stone. "You cannot fight me and win," Hades declared. "You may have stolen my power, but I am still a god." Perseus gripped his sword, his breath unsteady. Alexander, still weak, forced himself upright. Helios stood between them and the darkness, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he raised his blade, pointing it directly at Hades. "We end this," he said. The god of the underworld smiled coldly. "Then come and die." The final battle had begun. The temple trembled as Hades' monstrous form lunged forward, its claws ripping through the air like thunder. Perseus barely dodged in time, rolling across the shattered stone floor. Alexander stumbled back, his body still weak from the chains, but his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop Hades. Not just delay him, but end this once and for all. Helios stood firm, his blade glowing with stolen fire. He had absorbed Hades' power before. Could he do it again? He gritted his teeth and charged, his sword clashing against the god's monstrous claws. The impact sent a shockwave through the temple, cracks forming along the walls. Hades barely flinched. "You are a fool, Helios," he spat. "You cannot defeat the one who created you." Perseus saw his chance. While Hades focused on Helios, he darted forward, slashing at the creature's leg. His blade struck true, but the wound sealed instantly, as if time itself reversed. His stomach twisted. Hades wasn't just powerful, he was invincible. "Nothing works," he muttered, glancing at Alexander. His brother's eyes flickered with understanding. "Then we don't attack him directly," Alexander whispered. He turned, scanning the temple. The prophecy had mentioned something about balance. About a weapon hidden in the ruins of Atlantis. What if the real weapon wasn't a sword, but a way to strip Hades of his power? His gaze landed on the shattered remains of an old altar, glowing faintly with ancient symbols. His heart pounded. That was it. "Perseus, Helios, we need to get him to the altar." Helios blocked another devastating blow, his arms shaking from the force. "Easier said than done," he muttered. But Perseus didn't hesitate. He charged again, this time not to attack, but to bait. "Hey, god of the dead," he yelled, slashing wildly. "Afraid of a real fight?" Hades snarled, turning his full attention to Perseus. That was the opening Helios needed. He raised his sword high, focusing every ounce of energy into the blade. The stolen fire roared to life, crackling with raw power. Then, with one precise strike, he slashed through Hades' shadowy form, not to kill, but to drive him back. The force sent Hades staggering toward the altar, his monstrous body colliding with the ancient stone. The symbols on the altar pulsed, reacting to his presence. The temple trembled again, but this time, it wasn't from Hades' power. It was from something greater, something older. Alexander stepped forward, his voice steady. "It's over, Hades." The god of the underworld's expression finally shifted. From rage to realization, he had fallen into their trap. The air in the temple grew impossibly thick, charged with an ancient force even Hades couldn't control. The altar beneath him pulsed with golden light, its ancient symbols glowing brighter with every passing second. Hades snarled, trying to pull away, but something unseen held him in place. Alexander stepped forward, his mind racing. This was it. The power hidden beneath Atlantis wasn't a weapon meant to kill Hades. It was a seal, a force designed to trap a god. You knew, Hades growled, his voice laced with fury. You planned this. Alexander's hands trembled, but he met the god's burning gaze. You've ruled the underworld for too long. It's time you stayed there. Perseus wasted no time. He rushed toward the altar, placing his hands on the stone, feeling the ancient power surge through his veins. The ground beneath them cracked as golden chains erupted from the altar, wrapping around Hades' monstrous form. He roared in defiance, his shadows lashing out violently. One tendril struck Perseus, knocking him back with a painful grunt. But Helios was already moving. He stepped forward, raising his sword one last time. You made me to serve you, he said, his voice steady, but I was never yours to command. With a final, devastating slash, he drove his blade into the altar, unleashing the full force of the seal. A blinding explosion of energy filled the temple. The shadows screamed as they were pulled inward, collapsing into the altar like a vortex swallowing the night itself. Hades' monstrous form twisted, his face contorted in rage. This is not the end, he bellowed. I will return. The last of his voice was drowned out as the golden chains tightened, dragging him into the depths of the altar, and then silence. The temple stood still, the air light for the first time in what felt like eternity. Perseus, panting, looked around. Hades was gone. The battle was over. Helios staggered, his sword dimming as the last of the dark fire faded. Alexander collapsed onto his knees, breathing heavily. It was done. They had won. But as the dust settled, Perseus turned to Helios. What happens now? He asked. Helios looked at his hands, once built for destruction, now trembling with something else. I don't know, he admitted. For the first time, I get to choose. Perseus nodded, understanding more than words could express. They had defeated Hades, but their journey was far from over. The world had changed, and so had they. The sons of Zeus had faced their greatest trial, proving that fate was not written in stone. Power was not in the hands of gods alone, but in those who dared to fight for what was right. No destiny is unchangeable. No fate is absolute. The power to shape your story is always in your hands.